everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, the 9th. So I apologize. I had to post an older video of the Exorcist class, but as you could see, that class basically reviewed some of the major elements of the film, a film that I'm not even asking you to watch in its entirety unless you decide to do so, just because of its graphic nature. And if you decide to watch just the first half hour or so, I think you'll get an idea of some of the ways that this film uses imagery and symbolism. And I've always said that this film is misunderstood, as well as the text, because it comes from a best selling novel. That the story is really about the exorcist. It's not about the girl who is possessed. And in this case, we have two exorcists. We have Father Merrin and Father Karras. And the opening scene confused many audiences where it's set in Iraq, which is supposedly the birthplace of the fallen man, and the idea of how that might be connected, the sense that this is some ancient evil, that there is something supernatural going on. Though many people have said the truest horror of the film is watching some of the barbaric medical procedures that Regan MacNeil has to undergo. And that said, I've always said that all of these characters have their own demons, whether or not you want to see this as a literal demonic supernatural entity or the psychological demons that all of these characters are haunted from. And it just seems so appropriate that if we're going to start The Exorcist in Iraq, with this idea of other and the fall of man, that we go to perhaps the new place of evil in the United States being Washington, D.C. And Georgetown University was used for the filming. In fact, that staircase does exist. It's become quite the tourist attraction. And one of the claims to fame of this film was that it was nominated for 10 Academy Awards. So we know Sinners was awarded or nominated for even more, which we will talk about as the semester progresses. The Exorcist won for sound and Best Adapted Screenplay. And there were lots of subliminal techniques that were used to disorient audiences, whether they be visual or audio. There certainly is the religious element that would disturb many audiences. And it was a time of pretty open drug use. So individuals would sometimes go to the theater under the influence. Perhaps all of these things contributed to the kind of cultural hysteria that was associated with the film, which is what your attendance was. And the film is basically based on loosely documented exorcisms. There's some that are documented within the Bible itself. But of course, when people think of The Exorcist, they think of the gross out, as Stephen King calls it. The idea of being as violent and as being as specific as possible with bodily functions. And we had talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the semester. There are some of the theories about the sense that the inner body should not be exposed outwardly, and that's one of the most discomforting images and feelings that one could express. Um, Probably Regan MacNeil will be known forever as the girl who was spitting out pea soup. That was how they did the special effects of her vomiting and her head turning 360 degrees, which is actually a prop that's in the Smithsonian. And I think that the film holds up fairly well, considering that they didn't have the kind of technological advancements that we do today. The inner demons and the inner psychology of what is evil, and perhaps true evil is greater in the world of humanity than it could ever be in the supernatural world. It's something that's reiterated in the text itself, which follows the screenplay very carefully. And the original version of The Exorcist had about maybe 10 minutes or so of deleted scenes. They were thought to be too graphic, actually, or unnecessary to forwarding the plot. One of them, I think, was very necessary for forwarding the plot, and this is when Karis and Marin are speaking about the purpose of possession, which is really to torment those who are surrounding the possessed person. So, if we want to think about Chris and her demons of guilt and privilege, an actress who basically lies for a living. That's what actors do. And it's very convenient that she lives near a church and that she's atheist and that she's divorced, which would have been considered to be rather sinful during this time period. And there's a Ouija board in the house. But contrast that with Father Karras's mother, who's living in abject poverty, and both of those worlds can exist simultaneously. Alcohol itself is presented as a demon, as something that we see very commonly in Edgar Allan Poe. Definitely, it's here with Dennings. We get a sense of the film, some of the turmoil of the 1970s, and it was a place of college campus protest, drugs, Vietnam, and the idea that youths were unrecognizable to parents, that they were monstrosities. The world was going to hell, and they certainly oftentimes acted, they being youths, as if they were possessed when they were under the influence. And this sense of doors, we're entering a doorway into a new world. I think the filmmakers take great care in filming doors in that respect. We get some suggestion that some of the events might be paranormal, which is related to poltergeist activity, usually associated with a female in adolescence. And the assumption is that the hormone changes, in particular, that a female undergoes, is one of the reasons why poltergeist activity, which is supposedly controlled by the adolescent girl herself, though sometimes it could be an adolescent boy. Feelings of sexual frustration, feelings of anger, feelings of confusion that manifest themselves in the physical world, such as moving objects, for instance. Of course, the supernatural element with this idea of the demon Pazuzu and Iraq is embedded in there as well. But I'd argue, and in fact, I still do argue, that perhaps one of the biggest evils that exists in society is this contrast of wealth and poverty existing side by side. So if you think about the dinner party that Chris was throwing, in contrast to some of the scenes of Karras's mother in her dilapidated apartment, then you can understand perhaps why I would say that. And I kind of cheated again. As you know, I cheated in the 1960s by giving you two films because the 1960s really was a tumultuous time that spilled over into the 1970s. And technically, the film that I've selected to represent the 1980s is from the 1970s, 1978, in fact. And it's because of the kind of influence this film had on the slasher and horror genre that was so popular in the 1980s. So, this film, Halloween, directed by John Carpenter on a shoestring budget, basically became hugely popular and incredibly economically profitable. If you watch the film, which is what you are doing today, is you will see a serial killer that in many ways is reminiscent of some of the elements that we saw in Psycho. In fact, John Carpenter was very much influenced by the film Psycho. So much so that he's giving characters the same names. So much so that the lead in Halloween, Jamie Lee Curtis, happens to be the daughter of Vivien Leigh, who is basically the main female lead in Psycho. So that's perhaps a happy coincidence. But the sense of being able to see from the perspective of the killer, which is something that Psycho began to give us through the eye of the voyeur, is something that we definitely see in Halloween as well. And many people have argued that these films are also a prelude, these slasher films, to some of the pushback that was going on during the Reagan times, which were very conservative times. And that these films, while they were seen to be in some ways rather questioning of conservative values, when you really think about it, they reinforce conservative ideology where you've got a group of wayward teens in the time period. They were oftentimes known as latchkey kids, where women were entering the workforce, childcare hadn't yet been arranged, so that children and teenagers were basically home alone after they returned from school. Notice that in Halloween, there are very few adults. Basically, the teens are left to their own devices, and they do what is usually suspected of teens. They get into problematic behavior, drinking, drug use, sexual behaviors. And it's become cliche now with the formula of the slasher film that those teenagers who are engaging in that behavior are killed by some sort of a shadowy figure, an authoritarian force, if you want to think of it that way. The sole survivor has become famously known as the final girl, which is usually a female who is virginal and is not engaged in the same level of vice as her friends and her peers. Um, that perhaps is her reward for surviving, but she experiences great pain and great torment and great humiliation along the way. And definitely we can see that in Halloween as well, which was first released in Kansas City as an independent film. And notice how many independent films have had such impact in the horror genre. A budget of $320,000, which is nothing today and would not have been much more in 1978, bringing in over $55 million in sales, one of the highest grossing independent films of all time. Though we'll revisit this idea when we talk about the 90s and we talk about something like the Blair Witch Project. We continue to see an idea that has been experimented with for a couple of decades now in horror films, the collapse of the family. The Halloween director, John Carpenter, actually has a background in film studies, which was unusual for some of the directors of the past. He actually graduated from USC, University of Southern California. And he was responsible for that iconic soundtrack, so simple, but yet almost like the soundtrack of The Exorcist. So simple, but yet it is so powerful that you just hear a few notes and you're able to identify where it comes from. Another film that oftentimes is classified as a horror film that also has an iconic soundtrack is Jaws. All you have to do is hum a couple of notes, doo-doo, doo-doo, doo-doo. And of course, you've got the idea of this shark that seems to have almost supernatural ability in terms of its ability to hunt prey. And it was a tough one trying to decide what to do for the 1980s and also what to do for the 1970s in terms of our films, because in many ways the 1970s and the early 1980s were the heyday of horror film. I think it's beginning to reinvigorate itself now. We might be in a new heyday, which makes a certain level of sense if you're in particularly challenging times politically, economically, or culturally. Well, horror film provides the opportunity for escapism, as we saw with the early days of horror film in the 1930s, but it also provides an opportunity for social commentary as well. And at the time, they used something called the Panaglide. It is a kind of steady cam, if you will, in order to give us the murderer's view. So now we're seeing many more sophisticated cinematic techniques. If you know anything about the 1980s, usually classified by the presidency of the time with Ronald Reagan, where it reinforced this idea of a return to conservative values. And again, things like sexual promiscuity, smoking marijuana are very much punished by this idea of serial killer and the sense that no place is safe, not even the seemingly safe suburbia. And that's an idea that we've been talking about since basically Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Little interesting piece of trivia, the mask that Michael Myers wears is basically a mask of William Shatner of Star Trek fame that was bought and slightly altered. Um, I don't know if there's any meaning to that, but you can do with that as you will. But this sense of appearance versus reality, what is under the mask, is an idea that we've talked about with Suburbia as well, that there is corruption underneath the mask, and there is sin and there is evil underneath the mask. And also perhaps the sense that you could really never put a face on evil, because evil is unquantifiable. One of the things they talk about in the movie is that it seems to be this overwhelming force. And thinking about a knife as a phallic symbol leads to all kinds of possibility of sexual frustration and repression. Some have argued that that's illustrated in our main female character as she's stabbing over and over again. This inhumanity of murderers, though, I think is really what you can get with this genre. And of course, it's come to the point of absurdity that these films ended with a certain level of ambiguity, which is an element of horror film, but also a very practical element if you are thinking about the possibility of sequel. And these slasher films took the idea of sequel to the extreme. So I like to joke Friday the 13th, part 87, or so forth. It's basically the similar formula over and over and over again. But it all begins with Halloween. So even though most of those films came out in the 80s, it started with a film from 1978. And the fact that it's set during Halloween leads to all kinds of supernatural possibilities. I mean, Halloween night is supposed to be the night where the veil is the thinnest between the living and the dead. In other words, supernatural entities. We begin the film with a pumpkin that's used to basically the jack-o'-lantern to set the mood. But if you know anything about the folklore associated with the pumpkin, it's basically used to light the way in the netherworld. There's lots of folkloric traditions associated with Halloween. And one of them is about the jack-o'-lantern, which comes from an Irish legend that basically Jack was so evil that the devil never wanted him in the afterlife. Certainly, God never wanted Jack in the afterlife. So when Jack died, he was rejected by both God and Satan, but both felt pity on Jack and provided him with a light to light his way in the netherworld. This light would be represented by the Irish symbolically on Halloween with a large gourd that would have some sort of lighting apparatus within it. And of course, if you know about the Great Irish Famine, the Great Potato Famine, and all of the immigration that occurred to the United States, and the Irish who wanted to continue to celebrate this tradition found that gourds in the United States were not comparable to the gourds in Ireland, but we did have something called the pumpkin that looked pretty comparable. And there it is, the jack-o'-lantern. So this was Jack's lantern to light his way, which is why we call it a jack-o'-lantern. We also light jack-o'-lanterns to keep evil spirits away. And of course, the jack-o'-lantern or the light isn't going to keep away this unstoppable, unkillable Michael. And maybe that's the symbolic message, is that you can't really kill evil. And it doesn't have explanation or motivation. And interestingly, there is a mass market paperback, but it was written after the film, not before the film. Usually it is the novel that helps to influence the film. We've seen this multiple times, but in this instance, it was the film that influenced the novel. So I also wanted to mention to you to remind you that we are in registration now. So as a returning student, you have the ability to register now. You can see that in our Google Notes below. I have included a link so that you can look at our course catalog for the fall and spring, or I'm sorry, for the summer and fall semesters. And the summer sessions is very condensed. It basically uses half the amount of time for the same amount of work. So in a typical semester, we have approximately 16 weeks. A summer session, you have approximately 8 weeks to do the same amount of work. The classes usually are smaller and there's less selection, but it certainly serves a certain population of students, especially if they're looking to advance their degree more quickly, And we divide the summer up into two sections. The first part of the summer that begins at the ending of the spring semester after finals and goes into early July. And then the second summer part, or the second section of the summer, which begins in mid-July and ends right before the fall semester. And you can see that the classes I will be teaching, if you're interested, in the summer session are all online and conducted much like this class, with recorded videos and then class discussions and so forth, and assignments. One is an English class, English 247, Women in Literature 1, and that is for first summer session. And then I have two in the second summer session, also online. One is a medium popular culture class, and the other is a public speaking class, which might sound a bit odd doing public speaking online, unless you think about how the world has changed since COVID. And this class is a wonderful example. How much of our communication is done via screens, whether it be in Zoom or it be in recordings. So what students do in this public speaking class is that they record their speeches and then post them on Moodle so that their classmates can view them, and then we can all comment. So not necessarily ideal, but it is the reality of our world that we're probably communicating perhaps as much via screen as we are in person. So it does serve its purpose in that respect. So if you wanted more information about those classes, just reach out to me. For the fall semester, what I will be teaching is English 112, which is Introduction to Literature, and I've got multiple sections of that online as well as in person. And I will also be teaching Gothic literature, which is a wonderful companion to horror film, though those are two separate classes. So we read texts like Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Exorcist. So some of these films you are already familiar with, some you may not necessarily be familiar with. I don't know necessarily if you're familiar with the text or not. That is a English 200 level class, so it satisfies your advanced English requirement if you've got one, if you are pursuing a general education degree. And I'm also teaching a women in lit and a women in literature class as well, and also online. The same class that I'm teaching in the summer, I'm teaching in the fall, but in an extended format of 16 weeks, not 8 weeks. Again, if you have any questions, let me know, and I'll be happy to answer them. Your advisor should have reached out to you by this point. If not, you can reach out to your advisor. And again, you can look at the course catalog. Depending on the advisor, some advisors have released student pins, so students can register themselves, which is what I've done. But if not, you can always touch base with your advisor, or the advising center is another way to register yourself, or to have yourself registered, I should say. So there's lots of different ways to do it, and I encourage you to register early rather than later, just so that you can get the broadest selections of times and teachers and classes that you would want. And you can certainly change your mind anywhere along the way, so it's very easy to do drop add. But we're not starting registration for new students until next week, so basically you have the first opportunity as a returning student to register for classes. So I encourage you to take care of that. And I don't know if there are any potential English majors out there. I know many students have to take an advanced literature course, what we call an English 200 class. If you take 6 of them, basically you can graduate with a concentration in English. It basically is the same as a liberal arts general, but most of the electives are devoted to English classes. And one of those English classes is indeed Gothic literature. So there are about, maybe 20 students or so on campus that are pursuing that. And I'm the advisor for that, but you could talk to anybody in the English department if you so wanted to do that. So at this point, as you know, I've fallen a little bit behind with reading the discussion forum responses, but I will be catching up. And I hope that you are putting some serious thought into your final project, which you can hand in at any point, but the last day that you can hand it in would be the last day of class. And in terms of the final project, you can see that in the third section, the notes below, I had some information about quotation, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more next class. But basically, if you are quoting from film, you need to quote from a time stamp. You don't necessarily need to quote from a page number the way we usually do when you're quoting. At the ending of a quote, we use the MLA system, the Modern Language Association system. I hope this sounds familiar from English 101. And you put in the least amount of information in parentheses following that quote, the least amount of information necessary for a reader to identify where that quote appears. So the reader could, in theory, verify the authenticity of that quote if they so wanted. And usually the least amount of information is a page number if you're using a book, or an author surname if you're using a website. And then you've got a works cited page at the very ending of your paper that lists all of the sources that you've cited with additional detail, things like publisher and place of publication or website address or whatever the case may happen to be. And again, I will talk a little bit more about quotation and final projects as we get a little bit closer to the ending of the semester. But since this is a film class, if you are quoting from the films themselves, then you are quoting from the timestamps. As always, I've been trying to provide you with free links whenever possible, but all of these films are available in the GCC library, and they're usually available in various streaming services as well. I'll continue, but it becomes increasingly difficult as we get to more contemporary films to find free links online. So if you happen to find a free link online that I haven't found, or is better than the link I found, if you could please share that with me, I would be very grateful. As you know, it wasn't easy finding a link for The Exorcist, for instance. A little bit easier with finding a link for Halloween. So I'm going to leave you at this point, because I'm cognizant of the time, with watching Halloween. And our attendance question for this will be, why do you think Halloween was such an incredibly successful movie? Again, it earned $55 million in sales, one of the highest grossing independent films of all time. So somehow this film captured the public imagination. Again, asking questions that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers. I'm more interested in your reasoning. You're not required to respond to your peers. Always encouraged to, though. But you are required to read your peers' responses and ultimately my responses, so I'll be catching up with that as well. And as we get closer and closer to the ending of the semester, please reach out to me about ideas that you might have for your final project, or questions that you might have for your final project, where you get to focus on a particular element of horror film for our purposes, because that happens to be the theme for this particular semester. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. We'll put a little bit of closure onto Halloween, our film representing the 1980s, even though it came out in 1978. And we will talk about the 1990s and the very iconic Blair Witch Project, and how and why I feel that the Blair Witch Project is really representative of the 1990s. Take care. Bye-bye.